Today, we're very fortunate to have with us John Parrish Peede, who currently serves as the chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Previous to his confirmation in 2018, John had served in numerous positions, including as the publisher of the Virginia Quarterly Review at the University of Virginia, as a literature grants director for the National Endowment for the Arts, as a counselor to the chair of the National Endowment for the Arts, as director of the NEA's Big Read program, and as a director of communications at Millsap College and editor of Mercer University Press. John has written speeches for U.S. presidents and first ladies, been a literary critic, and for 7 years he led writing workshops for U.S. troops in Afghanistan, the Persian Gulf, England, Italy, Kyrgyzstan, and other domestic military bases. The NEH, for those of you who don't know about the National Endowment for Humanities, is the lead federal agency supporting scholarship in the humanities. Under John's leadership at the NEH, he has created new programs aimed at building infrastructure at humanities institutions around the country, issued emergency grants for cultural organizations affected by hurricanes, expanded museum exhibits, and formed new partnerships to promote the humanities with military families and to revitalize Native American languages. John holds a bachelor's degree in English from Vanderbilt University and a master's in Southern Studies from the University of Mississippi. His talk today is entitled Building a More Perfect Union, a Cultural Policy for the 21st Century. Joining me now in welcoming John Parrish.
Thank you. Glad you're here. I'm gonna do my bit, but I think the pizza's done most of the work for the audience. So if you leave with that good feeling, then I'll say some of it was me and a lot of it was the pizza. Director Clayton, thank you, and also for so many of the people who've shown us around the campus, and we will be meeting with from President Schultz down. We appreciate it, Professor Weber. Thank you. So I have some prepared remarks, but I really think in a lot of ways the conversation comes alive in the Q&A. So we'll leave a good bit of time for that. And for starters, I come before you as someone who's from a rural state and from a rural region of a rural state, and also as a citizen who believes that the economic prosperity of our nation, certainly the regions we're from, are inseparable from having an informed populace. And so that's why it's so important to not only be at a public policy center, but to have one on a campus such as this. And to remind you of the history of our agency, LBJ as president in 1965, the Great Society legislation, created the NEA, the Arts Endowment, and the NEH, the Humanities Endowment. And the language of that creation was so thoughtful, it still resonates. And it begins in part by saying that democracy demands wisdom. Democracy demands wisdom and vision in its citizens. And we take those words to heart. And by the way, not just wisdom and vision in our elected officials, but in each of us. The idea that we have a civic responsibility ourselves. And I don't believe the fact that we have a civic responsibility can be overstated. And also as chairman, I sometimes come out of literature. And so 20th century literature, and I'll often quote Zora Hurston, great novelist, folklorist, as an African American, wasn't always as welcome into the official research centers, did not have this, the funding that others might have, that people enjoy at this great university. And whenever we're being too esoteric, too scholarly, remember what Zora Hurston said. She said, research is formalized curiosity. So if you ask me what I'm in the business of, whether it's the arts, the humanities, higher education, I'm in the business of curiosity. And I want to fund and I want to meet people. They're in the business of curiosity too. And so that's someone from my own area of study. But the Humanities Endowment, and particularly in Washington, D.C., Jefferson's presence is always there. And Thomas Jefferson said something in 1816, I think, that guides some thinking. And to be clear, he was a very flawed vessel for his wisdom. And I think we are all, unfortunately, rather flawed vessels for our wisdom. But if you take the creation being, as my friend Dana Gioia says, often wiser than the creator, here's what Jefferson said in 1816. He said, If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and will never be. That's categorically correct. And if you want to think about the mission of the endowment since 1965, 11 chairmen of various political persuasions, I think we've all been united. Congressman Jim Leach, chairman before me, was here with the Civility Tour, and we're all coming back to the same language that we are. It seems to me that to have the endowment is not so much just pushing it back about ignorance, not to frame it in the negative, but to frame it, what are we trying to push forward? And those are those constitutional rights and freedoms that were ideals we've lived up to in an uneven manner, but ideals nevertheless. And when I talk about the importance of those ideals, I'm often talking about them from the perspective of, say, Frederick Douglass in his July 5th speech, which you haven't read before. Is a great work for calling for abolition of slavery, but also it is a surprisingly patriotic work too. And I think we're allowed to do that in the humanities. We're allowed to hold many complex ideas together. You know, I think that's the whole point of an undergraduate education, and I say that as somebody who has, my daughter is a sophomore in college, is the idea that we hold complex things together and find a narrative through them. Now, let me also tell you where we are as an agency. I don't think the success of an agency is defined by its budget or a university, but still, let me put a few numbers to it. Our budget's $155 million. That is the largest budget since the year 2010. It has increased every year the last 3 years under the House and the Senate, under both parties. The House of Representatives under the Democrats has recommended a significant increase. The Senate Subcommittee of Interior has also recommended an increase under Republican leadership under Lisa Murkowski. And what does that mean in Washington State? Well, besides the director grants, about 40% of our grant dollars go to our state partners. So that makes a real difference here. So every time we have $1 million increase, that's at least $400,000 increase across the states. And so, for example, our appropriation funds about $900,000 of the Humanities Washington budget. And I know the director was saying that the Speakers Bureau here is something that's done in collaboration with the state council under Julie Ziegler, who's just wonderful, and our whole team is. And their projects vary from the Center for Cultural Washington Traditions, and of course their involvement with primetime reading initiatives and other matters such as that. And I know we're joining her staff tomorrow, so I don't know if anybody's here from the board or the staff, but if you are, I'd certainly like to recognize you. I don't know if we have anyone to see them tomorrow. And in terms of direct grants to the state, since 1965, we've awarded $52 million to the state. And what I really like is the idea that the funding is increasing substantially. In the last decade, that number has been $20 million. So we are now, in the last decade, funding at about 200% of the historic norm. And that's a conversation we want to keep going here. And so that's a little bit of the housekeeping. So in terms of policy, I think I'm like many of you. I'm passionate in my life about the arts, the humanities, and the sciences. By the way, I don't draw large distinctions between them. I was floundering in chemistry in my third year, but nevertheless, I was in chemistry in the nephrology lab and graduated with an English degree. And I think what unites us all across the divisions and disciplines is some level of worry about the decline of the understanding of the value of higher education to our society, to our economy, to our culture, to our prosperity, which is to say, to our national defense. And if we are to successfully tackle these issues, we must be passionate about policy making. But how does one translate policy, or passion rather, into policy? First, you need to outline from the start what your values are. What do your policy decisions emanate from? And so when I came on as the chairman, on the one hand, a lot of people knew me from my service at the Arts Endowment, but not necessarily the humanities. The White House had recommended the closure of the agency, and so there were a lot of questions about what would be my particular vision. And so when I was at that time acting chairman, before I spent about 8 months with my friends at the FBI, I may be the only one going through a Senate confirmation where you have to give them everything you've written since age 18 has been published. And so they saw more bad poetry, I think, from me than fair warning, if you publish doggerel in the college newspaper, you will eventually have to turn it over to the FBI. And I did. They endured the failure of the ABAB rhyme scheme and the failure of counting the metric sheet properly. But I wanted to outline my values and the core values of the agency. And in many ways, the agency operated this with this ethos. So I was not bringing a new ethos to the agency, but I was articulating the vision in my own words. And I said that the Humanities Endowment is committed to unfettered access to knowledge, to the primacy of critical reasoning, apolitical research, scholarship, and content, which is to say policymaking, mutual respect in our interactions, and robust dialogues where we do not set up as straw men, as substitutes for those of goodwill who see the world in sharply different terms than we do. In short, I was saying we must hold fast to the best traditions of the humanities. And on a matter of how to interact with policymakers whose views differ from our own, I'll never forget the first time I was staffing Dana Gioia. You may know Chairman Gioia. He's American Book Award-winning poet. Was a vice president of General Foods, an incredible critic of poetry and champion of culture. And I was going to staff him on the Hill, and I forget if we're going to the Rayburn building or which of the office buildings we're going to, but we're getting out of the car, and I've known him now more than half my life, but I've known him for 15 years then, so we're certainly not just work colleagues. And he said, John, there are only two types of people in this building. There are friends and our future friends. And if you don't get that, you don't work for me. And now I will say in the 15 years that followed, I have met with a lot of future friends of the arts and the humanities. Having said that, I have a greater, I think, appreciation for our common endeavor because of those future friends, because they require me to refine our conversation. It's not just a wink, we all believe this, don't we? We're all sensible people, we believe this, don't we? But it's the idea that you have to build a case. So we're under the Interior Subcommittee, for example. And when we were in the Bush administration, particularly in the West, a lot of the Republican members of Congress actually supported the arts and culture, but the problem was, if you increased the subcommittee, then you had to take dollars away from firefighting in the West. We had somebody who was from a culturally conservative district in Florida, and she liked us, but if they gave an increase, it would go away from desalination efforts in the Everglades. From my background, a Democrat in Louisiana, the trouble there for that individual in terms of the block for making great increases was that it's interior again, so this is environmental again. So if you want to have wetland restoration to fight off the hurricanes in Louisiana, that's going to get funded under Interior and the Army Corps of Engineers. So a lot of times that we think is a highly political, ideological battleground is somebody making an argument for their area. And so in the same way that I'm meeting with other people, my friends who work at CDC, do we not want to cure these diseases? So we need to understand that that not everything is a battleground for the reasons we think it is. And I'd say this is a middle child, so I'm used to trying to find a path through. But when we talk about policy making, it is, I say a lot about being in relationship with others. I'm a Southerner, a very front porch type of person. And most of the successful policy conversations I've had is about establishing relationship and learning what their needs and interests are rather than telling what my desires are. They're greatly different way of arriving at the same goal, it seems to me. And once you've established your values, then of course you listen and you observe as a policymaker, and at the appropriate time, one must act. And so today I'm going to focus on two matters. I'm going to bring them up rather quickly, and I think in the Q&A I'll talk more about the 250th, the semi-quincentennial of the nation. But first I want to talk in practical terms about the vital importance of a strong cultural sector for a diversified state and regional economy. I think sometimes we may think that a strong cultural sector is a conversation we had in Seattle, and certainly it should be and is being had there, but it should be being had in Pullman as well. And the state's prosperity is due to an interesting mix of industries, from information, of course, to agriculture, from Microsoft to Apple's, and in this case, I mean Washington Apples, not computers. And the ups and downs of the market impact whether you can retain talented teachers, maintain a good highway system, offer competitive retirement plans for state workers, and other general services. And in this abundance of resources, you're playing to your strengths, as you should. And I would add that the arts and the humanities are a strength too. Indeed, the state's unique cultural assets, from, as I said, Seattle to the folkways and spirituality of Washington's 29 federally recognized tribes, for example. This is an unequaled strength, and it's a continuing, renewing strength. And this industry, it should be said, is not at the mercy of the marketplace. It can't be dashed on the rocks because of a change in federal regulation or the impact of a trade dispute. Culture, when supported by the community and government leaders and civic leaders and university leaders, when it is presented here, such as it is at the Foley Institute, culture is a stable and dynamic and irreplaceable economic engine that enriches the lives of citizens, even as it enriches them financially. So to put numbers to it, according to the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, the arts and cultural sector across the nation is a $800 billion industry, which represents about 4.3% of the GDP. This is a larger share of our economy than transportation, agriculture, or construction. And because tourism is reported separately from arts and culture, the overall impact of the culture is greater. So when we think about who's making policy and what policy matters, we should bring these numbers together and thinking about it. In recent years, starting around 2014, in which is around the time that Washington began to be ranked as one of the top states in the country for business and quality of life, and at this time, its arts and cultural sector increased by size by 12%. Are these related matters? I would say, of course they are. At least a correlation. And by population, the arts and the culture are a major industry, representing about 8.3% of the state's gross product. And again, to put that into real numbers, that's 177,000 jobs in the state. Or another number, $21 billion, or more narrowly, 20.9, which I'm going to round up to $21 billion. That is the total compensation in the state of Washington for workers in the arts and cultural industry. So culture is big business, and it is good business. And the question I would have to ask is a policy question. It's one that can be answered by the people in the room, by fellow citizens, which is, what is being done to capitalize on this success story, to build upon it, to promote it far and wide? Are you claiming that? I can't overstate how important it is to claim your own excellence. Are you claiming it? And if so, why and how and to what extent? What are you doing to integrate the cultural sector into the education and the lives of young people who will take over the running of the state? The creative economy is not only the future, it is the present, and in many ways, it is the ongoing past. And then say it's the ongoing past, that is going to bring us as much as anything into a robust conversation about the 250th anniversary of nationhood. Because of course, we at the federal level are not talking about marking merely nationhood from 1776. It has to, by definition, include the people of the land, the indigenous voices in the land, and that is a story long before 1776. So if told right, if funded properly, if the grants applications come forward to our endowment, then this is an opportunity, it seems to me, to tell a much more comprehensive story about Native American and indigenous voices in these lands. And I want to be clear that I'm not merely advocating for a diversified economy, but for an economy that draws more heavily upon cultural natural assets. And I'm saying also that we as a nation need to attend to such assets, attend to them, because if we do not, slowly but surely, we will lose our way. We will lose any deep and abiding understanding of our nation's founding ideals. We will lose touch with what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. And my second point is a related one, which is I want to discuss the vital importance of civic education and its alarming condition across our high schools and too often across our universities. We live in a time of cultural amnesia. We must take concrete steps to address this matter. It's not merely a problem, it's an epidemic, one with clear, harmful societal implications. And so, and if one doubts that, think of the consequences of a world in which we have lost an understanding of the root causes of World War II, that we have lost any kind of deep cultural memory of the Holocaust and how it echoes in our times. That's not a small thing. And I want to highlight the mission of the NEH and how their work directly impacts the work of classroom teachers, of scholars, of researchers, curators, documentary filmmakers, publishers, and cultural institutions, especially in the area of civics. And again, that tie here with Foley, with what you were doing at the Institute with our funding. And in particular, I'm just going to highlight, not a long list, I'm going to give you about, I've tried this with a full list, and it turns out to just be reading a phone book. No one really needs that. So this will be representative, but a few focusing on the U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights. And then I want to say a little bit about our new initiative, and then we'll get to questions. So first, again, I don't want to just say we have a decline in civic knowledge. It's a quantifiable decline. And it's been measured from organizations on the political left, on the political right, and those that are in the middle and have no discernible political tendencies. And also some of the organizations that do represent somewhere on the continuum will often hire third-party groups to do this to reinforce the integrity of the results. So for example, I can highlight, and I could highlight other studies, but the American Council of Trustees and Alumni hired a third-party group to work with them for a 2016 report, A Crisis in Civic Education. In this study, and again with third-party research that they commissioned, here's some of the findings. Only 18% of U.S. colleges and universities even require one foundational class in U.S. history or government. And I purposely don't look at a campus when I come there, and I'm not trying to call out one campus. I'm trying to say if this is practice across the country, what might be the possible outcomes of that? Well, recent of college graduates rather, and in a multiple choice test, and so it allows for just good guessing, which helped me get in college, so I don't want to knock it. But 59% of college graduates on a multiple choice test, and to my recollection, they have 4 or 5 answers. They don't give you 20 to choose from. Stated that Jefferson, not Madison, was the creator of the U.S. Constitution, or the father of the Constitution, as we said. Now we understand it had multiple authors, but it would not have been Jefferson. And there was a time we would have known that. Fewer than half knew that Washington was the American general at Yorktown. A lot of people picked the British general as our general, which was not the case. 40% of college graduates don't know that the House of Representatives has the power to declare war. Doesn't know which house has the right between the White House and Congress to establish taxes. Does not know the roles of of any number of legislative matters, many of which have been under constant conversation. And by the way, I keep using the word college graduates. So you need to know that we're adding in college graduates that are above the age of 65, they're in their 50s, and what we're finding, for example, college graduates over the age of 65, 98% of them knew that the President of the United States does not have the authority to establish taxes. For recent college graduates, 25 to 34, only 74% knew that. So what we're having is we are, on the one hand, getting a lot of things right in our universities. My own background of literature, that it's a more diverse canon, that we're hearing a lot of voices never heard before. This is necessary and essential, and I've taught it. But we can have a both-and culture. We can hold on to some foundational levels of knowledge, even as we have some corrections to the historical record. But the difference of what we're losing in terms of core knowledge matters, and I see that play out in these kind of politically charged moments. I do hear when I meet with members of Congress a great deal about wanting to get back to some understanding of foundational documents. They might come at this from different sides of the ideological aisle, but they both say that it begins with having some understanding of what a representative democracy is and should be. And so there are ways, and none of these are unique to me, about how we might go to this. The curriculum change is certainly part of it. History departments returning to look a bit more at U.S. history, at diplomatic history, and constitutional history. The idea of survey classes. I know that not everyone loves them, but survey classes matter. If you put your best professors in there, I switched to English late in my career because I had a survey class that I knew that this is what had been speaking to me my whole life, and I believe in that. And so, yes, some curriculum changes would matter a great deal. Objective assessments, some benchmarks of historical understanding. And we're starting to see some significant foundations that are no longer willing to fund institutions that don't have this kind of commitment. I just met with a foundation that is now unwilling to fund any university that doesn't have a deep and clear commitment to free speech. The Chicago model, the idea that in 4 years on a campus, if you never hear an argument, the well-reasoned argument that you disagree with, then maybe that's a bit of an impoverished education that we should have, as we have in life, in jobs, in families, that we should have a robust exchange of fact-based conversations. And one way we have some of those is the deep commitment to the free exchange of ideas. And again, I'm doing this so I get to keep the coffee cup, but I'll say this is why you want a public policy center. Not all learning is going to happen in a classroom for a credit, and that's important to know too. I wasn't always the best student, but I paid my tuition to have access to 3 million books. I remember the letters of the PS 3500s. That's what I paid tuition for. Now, and I was work study, so I knew that somebody had to restack all the books that I didn't get quite back in the row, and I was doing my work study part on another part of the campus. But these things matter, and again, not every solution has to be in a credit-based classroom. So what are we doing at the Endowment to make a difference? We're trying to do concrete things, and again, we're going to go back to our founding legislation. 1965, war is coming. We are already getting into, we've already come into the age of assassinations. It is a country that is torn, deeply torn. And yet, both parties come together and they create these endowments, and they say, among other things, and it's worth reading 3 or 4 of these sentences, the arts and the humanities belong to all the people of the United States. Democracy demands wisdom and visions in its citizens. It must therefore foster and support a form of education and access to the arts and the humanities designed to make people of all backgrounds and wherever located masters of their technology and not as unthinking servants. Can you believe that? I mean, I think the college kids I know, and again, this is my daughters, to have anybody talk to you for an hour without a phone in your hand is a pretty, daunting idea. We were already in 1965. We're in the middle of a space race. We are trying to win the Cold War through our technology, espionage, American ingenuity, and yet we are riding into the creation of these. That one of our concerns is we must be masters of our technology and not its unthinking servants. It goes on to say, the arts and the humanities reflect a high place accorded by the American people to the nation's rich cultural heritage and to the fostering of mutual respect for diverse beliefs and values of all persons and groups. So that's what I get to do. I get to go around the country saying, this is our charge. Do you want to join us? Do you have a project we might fund? And so we fulfill that charge by funding documentaries and exhibitions in American history and government, funding, for example, not only Ken Burns' Vietnam film or a Civil War film back to his student days when he was doing the Brooklyn Bridge work. We have funded the preservation of founding documents, keeping the historical record intact for future generations. The Jefferson Papers, the Washington Papers, Adams Papers, but also the entire Adams family, not just the two presidents, but their wives and sisters as well. FDR, but also Eleanor Roosevelt, and of course not just presidents, but Mark Twain, Edison, Martin Luther King. We have funded essential scholarly research that sheds lights on the events and individuals that have shaped our country, support educational programs. I think a lot of you, if you're younger undergraduates, National History Day might be something you know from high school, and we helped create that with our initial funding. We have the Excitement website with free educational materials that 2.5 million teachers and students and homeschooled parents use as educational materials every year. We've funded since 1982 actually the scholarly editing, the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution and Bill of Rights. And this one's rather interesting. I'll tell you about the details of that. So that sounds okay, fine. You're preserving the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. That's what it sounds like. No, it's telling the ratification. It's a deep knowledge. So we're talking about thousands of sources, the sermons, the newspapers, the broadsides, the pamphlets, speeches, private letters, as if you're going through it in real time, state by state, because we take so many decisions to be made, and we kind of lose the idea of the back and forth. Again, the exchanges of policies, and sometimes, it's rather easy with historical hindsight to condemn some of these decisions, but you have to see the tension of the colonies. You can see Rhode Island always pushing above all for freedom of religion. That's why they broke off from the Massachusetts colony. And so that platform has to stay. And if there's some group that is more controlled by one church group, they want to push back on that. And what does Rhode Island trade off in language for that? So there's so many fascinating conversations. And you need we're always at the federal level only going to be a catalytic investor, not the complete investor in that preservation. But that level of nuance, it does take the federal level of adjudication of its value and bringing in national experts. I'll note another one. We've talked about what do we do for, say, the professors here, but it's also what do we do as students, both for the college students and high school students, for example. We funded the digital game on the ratification. And this was created by iCivics, a great organization. And this goes even down to the middle school level, where they have an immersive experience. And when you play the game, if you're the primary user, you're the role of a newspaper editor. And the students are tasked with getting interviews from a diverse set of characters. Those could be laborers, Native Americans, enslaved people, also the well-off landowners. And each one has a different perspective, and they'll adhere to Federalist and anti-Federalist position. And all of this emerges out of actual primary text materials. And so how do you, quote, win the game? How does it come to an end? Well, you have to convince 9 of the 13 to agree with you by publishing articles. And this, of course, is exactly the vote it actually took. And so, it's refining it based upon what your peers are doing. And so that's an example of that. And I won't linger over the films, but the Loving Story was also made into movie, but the idea of erasing the miscegenation laws that were in Virginia at that time and other parts of America, the '67 Supreme Court case. We funded that documentary. We did that long before the Hollywood movie. I think both have their value. And we have this year coming out the documentary on the 19th Amendment, the women's right to vote. So that's historically where we've been. So my chairmanship is to be a continuum of that and a new initiative for a more perfect union. And the idea is that as we approach the 250th anniversary of nationhood, 2026, the semi-quincentennial is called, that we might fund projects that lead to a deeper understanding of American history and culture and that advocate civic education and knowledge of our primary principles of government. And that this will help us to understand across the nation at whatever educational level the world's oldest constitutional democracy and how these founding ideals are met in a pluralistic society. And so, for example, we're noting on our grant applications the diverse topics that one might bring. That could be from Native American culture to rural life, to the rise of the industrial city, to the Civil War, to the Cold War, to the Civil Rights Movement, from projects that examine foundational documents in U.S. history, as well as projects that examine historical objects, places, traditions, events, and individuals who have shaped our states and our nations. And the other part of it, and I think I'll say more about this when we have a conversation, also brought back cultural infrastructure projects. And this could be bricks and mortar between the NEH and our sister agency, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, known as IMLS. We fund about $500 million a year. But when I came to Endowment, none of us were allowed to do bricks and mortar again. If these walls had to be moved and the HVAC dealt with and fiber optic, our funding wouldn't allow for that. And there are reasons for it. If it's a historic building, there are all these, number of rules. And it seemed to me that, and the problem with that, from a policy point of view, Congress gives us $155 million. And I give $1 million to reconstruct this space. And there's some kind of historic review that didn't go the way you projected. That's $1 million I've encumbered, but I have not awarded. And then I just do this 10 times across the country, and I have to go before Congress and say, $10 million that I didn't award. Next year I didn't award it. And they're going to say one of two things. We'll cut your budget, or we'll find a chairman who's capable of awarding a grant. Now, neither outcome do I desire. So there was a reason that we went away from. What I challenged my colleague is, tell me who we need in the General Counsel's office. Tell me who we need in the grants office. And they came back and said, we need a Section 106 expert. Great, let's get one. We need a NEPA expert. Great, let's get one. And so this is the idea of having a conversation. And so we loved that one of the first grants we did was the steeple and stabilizing this at Old Christ Church in Philadelphia. Benjamin Franklin's buried there. 6 members signed the declaration, attended it regularly. Betsy Wallace did, tons of others. The baptismal records that they showed me had a list also of all the Native American tribes that ever visited George Washington when he was there. They had that in the roll, so it was rather incredible. But as we did that, we were convening people from the region around Pennsylvania. And I loved talking there, and I'm so glad we did that in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is a $400 million construction project. Glad to do that. But the other person there was Miss Dennis from Dennis Farms, upstate Pennsylvania. So she is the 7th generation of African Americans who continually owned more than 100 acres. Her people began as free people, and once they had that land, they never lost it. And to tell her story, and that being a vision for infrastructure. And I'll be at the library later. We're also doing digital infrastructure. Those of us that came from book culture, I began my career as a book editor. You publish a book, it's going to live way beyond all the rest of us. On the other hand, the amount of us that can't access our old academic papers because the platforms have changed 10 times is staggering. There's nothing that has a shorter half-life in terms of preservation than a digital object. And so the endowment's starting to have conversations about digital infrastructure grants up to $750,000, so a reasonable amount of money, I would say. So those are a few of the things we're looking about as we work with the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission. And since I'm here in the West, I want to say that I spent a lot of time talking about the fact that it's not the story of 13 colonies, as much as that's an important story. I was with the Tlingit village in Alaska. We traveled by ferry a couple hours to get to a few weeks ago, and I was north of the Arctic Circle before that. And in both places, we were talking about nationhood in a very different time, in a very different sense of how time operates. And so I'm excited about it as a way that we might talk about community. And I want to underscore that that those of us that are leaders of cultural organizations, those in the room who seek to be one in the future, one of the things we must do is not allow ourselves to be looked at as a thing apart. We must not define our roles. We are gatekeepers, even as we insist on the importance of learning, the importance of knowledge, and all things, the importance of intellectual rigor. And I do worry about the free exchange of ideas and how it can sometimes be fraught on our campuses. And I worry about the long-standing educational contract that extended from the post-war GI Bill through our time of graduate education. I worry that that might be starting to unravel. And I don't believe there's a single cause or a single solution to this problem. But the path forward must include an openness to evaluating how and why the essential value of the university, the liberal arts, and the humanities are less and less understood. The issue has budget implications for our cultural organizations, but more importantly, it has societal implications for our rural, suburban, and urban communities alike. And my responsibility as chairman is to make sure that we expend our funds in a transparent manner that is in keeping with our founding legislation, our established guidelines, congressional intent, and broad administration priorities such as infrastructure. Or more simply, my job is to fulfill the title of our agency, to be truly national, to fund the humanities, to endow our communities with the richness that comes with a vibrant culture. We must, as policymakers, not merely be in proximity to our communities, but be in relationship. We must make every effort to have an impact beyond the walls of our campuses and cultural centers and into our larger communities among our fellow Americans. And notice I didn't say among real Americans. Humanists are real Americans. And as humanists, we must see our duty as not only preserving artifacts or underwriting research, or presenting exhibitions and films, but as a nearly sacred duty of pointing the way for the next generation so they too can live meaningful, fulfilling, impactful lives. Thank you.
So we have about 10, 15 minutes for some Q&A.
Sure.
Maybe I'll start us off.
Okay.
I'm tempted to ask you about a grant to remodel the Foley Institute. I'll resist that. So I want to pick up on a couple things you said. One is this comment at the very end about real Americans, and also your comment about the degradation of higher learning in our culture today. And it seems to me that there's an elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room is we are in a populist moment, both on the political left and the political right. And populism is a very complex set of ideas historically. But there's definitely an anti-intellectual, anti-scientific, anti-arts, and humanities component to populist thinking. And so I wonder if the NEH has given any thought to how we discuss and deal with this populist moment in culture right now. And it seems to me one of the answers can't be to try to defend the humanities and arts and sciences on the grounds that they produce economic value, because that strips humane values out of the discussion. So I wonder if NEH has thought about that at all.
No, certainly. And I make a comprehensive argument. Look, when I'm in rooms where I can just say, this matters, it makes a difference. Those are great rooms. And I was at the German Cultural Institute or Historical Institute in Washington with some other great people, Mary Sue Coleman, AAUP, the head of the Volkswagen Foundation, and another European organization. And they were on the European side making the argument that this is, you need to do it because it matters, because it's good. And everybody's more or less nodding. And I said, no, I mean, as a government official, I need to make an economic argument too. Now, I can tell you that on the humanities side, for every federal dollar we put into this district or this state, this university is going to generate about $5 additional dollars in economic activity. And on the arts side, it's 10 or 12 because they're selling tickets and what have you, whereas we might be preserving a library book or putting in the wall, and that doesn't immediately yield, an economic act beyond construction and such. So I do generally make a fairly integrated argument. But you're right about saying if we say it's 5-1 and any other industry can come forward and say we're 5.5-1, then they would win the day. And I do believe it's more comprehensive. I said to somebody, please name a great global city that have a strong cultural sector. I went through 40, even countries I haven't thought about in a long time, and I couldn't come up with what we might call a global city that didn't. So there are a lot of arguments to be made. This issue of being in a populace, one of the parts that matters about the humanities is it does let you know that there are cycles. And for a lot of people that can be, a level of relief. When I was first kind of introducing myself to the conference of 600 or 700 people, I read something I didn't read here, and it was acknowledging this kind of difficult moment that it seemed to be a divisive moment. And I just walked through some highlights between 64 and 68. I mean, we are clear, I'm in Washington, D.C. I can tell you where the fires, burned through in 68. I mean, we're not, assassinating people. We're not having the kind of just extraordinary ruptures that we had. We're doing augmented reality funding for Kent State University. We funded their museum. So on the May 1970, the student shooting, it'll be an augmented reality that you can have a viewfinder, let's say in the most generic sense, that you'll be taken back to that day. And you'll be filled to be present that day. And so even as I talk about that, I was rushing to give a speech in South Korea, and my staff said, could you just turn down, there's somebody in South Carolina who's going to get an award. They say they know you. We're going to tell them no, but we thought, and they just told me his name, and I said, I'll be there. And he said, well, you can't do it. It's 14 hours before you go to South Korea. You can't go to South Carolina. They're not that close. It just sounds like they are. And English major, they assume I don't know geography. And I said, no, we're going to do both. This is going to happen. And it was Cecil Williams, who was a young book editor. I edited his civil rights movement. He was a stringer for Jet and Ebony, young African-American man. A lot of his family's also Native American. And he took these incredible pictures, King's March. And the reason I bring that out is because we do know Kent State. We might not all remember May 1970. We know Kent State. We don't know what happened in Orangeburg, South Carolina. We don't know that troops shot into a gathering of students from 2 HBCUs and other African Americans outside of bowling alley. And so part of it is when we think it's terrible, I want to walk people through history, our nation's history, and others, and say that is the strength of republic, that you can go back and find frayings all the time, and usually there's some course correction. What I worry about, and I don't mind just, we don't need to be shy about attaching political affiliations to it. So the Pew Grant, not Pew Fellows, I might have which part of the Pew did it, but they did a research, and those who identify themselves as conservative or right of center, more than 50% of them said something to the effect that higher education was a net negative. That's a rough paraphrase, okay? And anybody has a more precise wording, correct me, but that's a rough paraphrase. And then, so if you said, okay, I'm fine with 50% of America, which would trouble me if anybody said that, but then you say, okay, we have those who identify as left of the center. Well, I spend most of my days with such individuals, what they'll say is, the student loan debt's crushing me, you know, I'm worried about my students. So if you say, okay, well, the working class or aspirational college students, they don't have a problem in higher education, but they can't access it or experience it. So then we're left with affluent, older, largely white people left of center, and this is who higher education is working for. That's not democracy. That's not how democracy works. So we're in a moment where if that much of the nation feels they're outside it, it's an oversimplification to say it's a left-right problem. What it is there's something structural in the way that we deliver education, and lots of people are looking at how we can address this. Is it 3-year degrees for certain fields versus 4-year degrees? Is it you know, a state university put in just an extraordinary tens of millions of dollars on one of these water slide things. I would have loved to have had that as an undergrad, but I would not have loved to have student debt on the back end of it. So it is back to, you know, my education worked with cinder block walls, you know, in my dorm, and so it is how we resource our institutions a little bit. It's certainly that state legislatures don't feel the need to fund them at the high level they did before, and you know, each state legislature is voted into office. So at a certain point, we're back to this issue of engaged citizenship. We're back to the idea of civic education, that if you want to stand for or against something, you need to know what you're standing for or against. And was it always this way or not? So that was a little too diffuse, and I know people have classes, so anybody walking out, you know, I understand. But it would be an oversimplification to say that it's literally political parties. There's more than political parties operating. And when I talk to people that are right of center about it, there is a level of student loan debt that's a great anxiety. Free speech issues, feeling their opinions aren't welcome to be voiced on campuses is significant. But I think the issue of welcome, I say this is again, you know, very much a Southerner, and I don't stay places I don't feel welcome, ever. None of us voluntarily do. None of us actually go in deep personal debt to stay somewhere for 4 years we don't feel welcome. So you can make a student feel welcome even as you challenge some of their preconceived notions of knowledge, you know, what have you. And that's a fine line. And the difference is, you know, when I was being educated, yeah, you know, my professors might make a ding against Reagan or something, but I didn't see their Twitter feed, you know, whatever. And then and you could flip the other side of it. If I had a conservative professor, he was so conservative, the other professors called him a Tory. Actually, they wouldn't even let the British system work. I mean, the American system work for, you know. But it didn't alienate students because they weren't seeing it all the time. And so I think, you know, we're in a moment where I'm always advocating for free expression, and professors are actively free expressing. And then if a student looks in that, like, I don't know if that person would be fair to me. And the truth is, most times that professor would be fair to them, actually. You know, that, you know, it's a tough thing. So I go back. I quoted a lot, I put in the speech, but André Gide, you know, French novelist, a philosopher. My French is terrible, so, you know, but in English, it's don't understand me too quickly. Don't say you hear my accent, you know my gender, you know where I'm from, you know my race, you know whatever, you know, and you know what there is to know about me. Don't understand me too quickly. And so, to the extent we have those nuanced conversations, will be better. But and I won't get into some things in liberal arts, like the decline of the major is real, but the amount of people enrolling in liberal arts classes is actually back up again. And I'm not trying to convince everybody not to be an engineer. I love being in the sciences. I just wasn't very good at it. You know, but it gave me a kind of system of thought. I love nothing more than being in the surgery ward. My dad was a doctor, and, you know, running the autoclave or whatever, you know, surgery ward intern. We have all these artificial barriers, and we need them for departments, but somehow we told you can't have these, you know, these thoughts across the lines, and it's just so fundamentally wrong, you know. So part of defending the university is to understand the value of liberal arts, because the liberal arts was the core, and as the liberal arts collapsed, in some ways, the understanding the public value of the university itself collapsed. And there's a distortion in the media about what actually happens on the campus, and that's a real problem too. I know this one gentleman
One
had
last question, bro.
yeah,
Sorry.
this gentleman had one first. Yeah.
Do you have much does the NEH have much influence over Hollywood? Because sometimes I don't think they remember the last 20 years, much less the last 1.
We don't. I'm not known for short answers, but the answer is we don't have an influence over Hollywood. We may bring certain stories together in a nonfiction treatment through a podcast or a documentary that turns them on to historical matter. And quite often, if you really are moved by something like Hidden Spaces and you want to find out the story, you'll find there's a scholarly book and we funded it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just curious because Hollywood kind of seems like it needs more intelligence. Anyway.
Shall I be diplomatic? More intelligence would be good for all of our organizations.
So unfortunately, our time is up. Let me just say this, I just want to say firsthand how important the NEH is. And the Foley Institute benefited from a large grant back in 2011 where we did a major conference on civility and democracy. And from that, we've now created a series of programs on civility and democracy, and it's been very successful and very, very in demand. And of course, we partner with Humanities Washington right now in the Speakers Bureau program. So it's been really a beneficial partnership for us. So in any case, I want to thank you very much for coming out. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And join me now in thanking